My rich husband filed for divorce and said, "I will leave you with nothing. I have the best lawyers." I simply nodded. He did not know that I had already transferred all his company assets into my name. What happened next? Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always ask me when I knew. They expect me to say it was the moment Richard stood across our kitchen island, his custom suit perfectly pressed, and told me he was leaving. But the truth is, I knew long before that morning. I knew the way you know a storm is coming before a single cloud appears. Something shifts in the air, and every cell in your body understands what your mind refuses to accept. We had been married for 17 years. 17 years of building something that looked, from the outside, like an American success story. Richard had the vision. I had the execution. He shook hands in boardrooms. I read every contract, signed every filing, stayed up until 2 a.m. untangling the legal architecture of deals he barely understood. When Mitchell Enterprises crossed $40 million in valuation, Richard gave an interview to a regional business magazine. He was photographed alone. I remember sitting in our living room in Scottsdale, Arizona, holding the glossy page and thinking, that's fine. I didn't need credit. I needed the company to survive. That was my first mistake, confusing loyalty with invisibility. Our home was a 5-bedroom property in the Arcadia neighborhood of Phoenix, the kind of house that has a wine cellar and a pool and a guest house that nobody uses. We had 2 dogs, a golden retriever named Biscuit and a shepherd mix named Duke. We had a standing reservation at Zinc Bistro on the first Saturday of every month. We had the appearance of a life. The first signal came in March, about 14 months before the divorce. Richard began taking calls in the garage, not occasionally, systematically. I noticed because Biscuit used to follow him everywhere, and suddenly Biscuit was being shut out of the garage too. A small thing. The kind of thing a wife files away without naming. Then came the financial statements. As the company's chief operating officer, a role I had held for 8 years, with my signature on every major transaction, I had full access to Mitchell Enterprises' accounts. In April, I noticed a $380,000 transfer to an entity called Meridian Pacific Holdings, LLC. I had never heard of it. I searched our internal records. Nothing. I asked Richard over dinner, casually, the way you ask about a grocery item. He said it was a vendor prepayment for a construction project in Tempe. He said it smoothly, without looking up from his phone. I smiled and said nothing. But that night, after Richard fell asleep, I sat at the desk in my home office and pulled up the Arizona Corporation Commission database. Meridian Pacific Holdings, LLC, had been registered 4 months earlier. Its registered agent was a law firm I didn't recognize. Its sole member was listed as a trust. My hands were completely steady as I took a screenshot. Over the next 6 weeks, I found 3 more transfers: $210,000, $175,000, $490,000, all to entities that shared the same formation pattern, registered within the previous year, minimal public footprint, trust structures obscuring ownership. The total was $1.255 million moved out of the operating accounts I oversaw. Someone was systematically draining Mitchell Enterprises, and only 2 people had the authority to approve transfers of that size. I began keeping a folder on an encrypted drive I purchased with cash at a Walmart in Mesa. I labeled it simply, Documentation. Then, on a Tuesday morning in May, the sky over Phoenix already white with heat by 8 a.m., Richard came into the kitchen while I was making coffee. He set down his phone face down on the counter, which he never did. He looked at me with the expression of a man who had rehearsed something. "Sarah," he said, "I want a divorce." He said it the way you might announce a flight delay, inconvenient but inevitable. I turned from the coffee maker and looked at him. "I've already spoken to my attorneys," he continued. "Jonathan Hale's firm. They're the best in the state." A pause. Deliberate, I realized later. "I want to be honest with you. We built this together, but the company is mine. My name, my vision. I'll make sure you're taken care of, but don't expect—" "Okay," I said. That was all. One word. He blinked. He had expected tears, or rage, or negotiation. He had prepared for a scene. My stillness unbalanced him more than screaming would have. "Okay?" he repeated. "I heard you," I said, and poured my coffee. What Richard Mitchell did not know, what he could not have known, was that the folder on my encrypted drive had grown to 214 pages. And what he understood even less was that 3 days earlier, I had made a series of perfectly legal, perfectly documented financial decisions in my capacity as Chief Operating Officer. I simply nodded and let him believe he had won. The day after Richard told me he wanted a divorce, I drove to Sedona alone. I needed to think somewhere that wasn't our house, somewhere his presence hadn't soaked into the walls. I took the 17 North and drove without music, the red rock formations rising around me like something ancient and indifferent. I checked into a small inn on the edge of town, paid cash for one night, and sat on the balcony watching the light change on Cathedral Rock until the sun went down. "What exactly do you have?" I asked myself, not in panic, in the deliberate clinical way I used to prepare cases back when I practiced law, before Richard, before I set down my bar card and became, in the language of our social circle, Richard's wife. What I had: 17 years of marriage, 2 dogs, a house that was mortgaged in both our names, and no personal income for the past 8 years. What Richard had: Jonathan Hale, widely regarded as the most aggressive divorce attorney in Maricopa County, and the confident assumption that a stay-at-home wife with no recent employment history was, legally speaking, manageable. What Richard had forgotten: I was not a stay-at-home wife. I was the Chief Operating Officer of Mitchell Enterprises. My name was on the operating agreement. My signature was on the property acquisition documents. My authorization codes were embedded in the company's banking infrastructure. I had not disappeared into domesticity. I had disappeared into the company's foundation, which is an entirely different thing. But knowing your strengths and knowing how to use them are 2 separate problems. And I had a more immediate one: fear. I won't romanticize that night in Sedona. I sat on that balcony and I was genuinely frightened. Not of Richard. I had stopped being afraid of Richard as a person years ago, somewhere around the time I realized his confidence was mostly performance. I was afraid of the machine. Jonathan Hale's firm had dismantled wealthy women in courtrooms across Arizona for 2 decades. I had watched it happen to a friend, Caroline Marsh, whose husband had similarly retained Hale. Caroline had walked away from a 12-year marriage with a settlement that barely covered her apartment deposit. The firm was methodical, well-resourced, and entirely without sentiment, and Richard had a 3-month head start. He had been planning this while I was still reviewing quarterly reports. Or had he? I ordered room service, a club sandwich I barely touched, and opened my laptop. I pulled up the encrypted drive. 214 pages of transaction records, entity searches, bank confirmations. And then I opened a second folder I had been assembling more quietly, one I hadn't fully named to myself yet. It contained the company's asset registry, every property, every holding, every LLC that fell under the Mitchell Enterprises umbrella. I started reading. By midnight, I had confirmed what I had suspected, but never quite assembled into a single coherent picture. Richard's lawyers were going to argue that Mitchell Enterprises was his separate property, founded before our marriage with premarital capital. That was partially true. He had started the company 3 years before we met, but what the company had become, the $47 million entity it was today, had been built almost entirely during our marriage. More specifically, it had been built by me. And here was what Richard had never sufficiently reckoned with. In 2019, when we restructured the company's holding framework to optimize for a potential acquisition offer that ultimately fell through, Richard had been in Dubai closing a hotel development deal. I had handled the restructuring paperwork with our corporate attorney at the time, a quiet man named Gerald Foster who retired the following year. In the reorganization, the company's most valuable real estate assets, 4 commercial properties in the Phoenix metro area, collectively worth approximately $18 million at current appraisal, had been transferred into a holding entity called Arcadia Asset Partners, LLC. Arcadia Asset Partners, LLC had 2 members, Richard Mitchell and Sarah Mitchell, equal shares. I had flagged it for Richard at the time. He had said, "Whatever Gerald recommends," and signed where I told him to. He had not revisited it since. In the years that followed, as property values climbed and the portfolio grew, I don't believe it ever crossed his mind. It crossed mine. On the drive back to Phoenix the next morning, I made 3 decisions. First, I would not contact a divorce attorney until I had spoken to someone who could help me understand the full scope of what I actually controlled. Second, I would not give Richard any indication that I was doing anything other than quietly accepting the situation. Third, I would call Diana Park. Diana had been my closest friend since law school. She had stayed in practice while I had not, and had spent the past decade specializing in high-asset family law in California. She was also the only person in my life who had never been charmed by Richard Mitchell. I called her from the car, somewhere on the 17, the red rocks behind me and the city ahead. "I need you to come to Phoenix," I said when she answered. A beat of silence. "How bad?" "He's hired Jonathan Hale." "I'll be there Thursday," she said without hesitation. I exhaled slowly and watched the desert slide past. For the first time since Richard's announcement, I did not feel like a woman being discarded. I felt like an attorney who had just found the relevant statute. Diana arrived on a Thursday evening, rolling a single carry-on through my front door with the efficiency of someone who had packed for depositions many times. She took one look at the house, the deliberately undisturbed surfaces, the dog beds still in their usual places, Richard's coffee mug still on the counter as if he might return for it, and said, "You're still sleeping here?" "He moved to the Biltmore," I said. "Corporate rate. He's billing it to the company." "Of course he is." She set her bag down and looked at me properly. "You look better than I expected." "I've been busy." We spread everything across the dining room table that night. My documentation folder, the corporate formation documents, the operating agreement, the Arcadia Asset Partners LLC filings, the property records. Diana went through it methodically, asking questions I answered from memory, occasionally stopping to make notes on a legal pad she'd brought in her bag. The dog sprawled under the table. The house was quiet. Around 11, Diana set down her pen. "Sarah," she said, "you know what you have here?" "Tell me." "You have an argument that Arcadia Asset Partners, LLC, is a marital asset, not a business asset. It was formed during the marriage. The properties inside it appreciated primarily during the marriage, and you are a 50% member. Richard's team is going to try to frame the entire company as his separate property. They can't do that with Arcadia. It's right there in the documents. She tapped the operating agreement. And that portfolio at current Phoenix commercial real estate valuations, I had it informally appraised, I said, 18 to 21 million. Diana was quiet for a moment. His lawyers don't know about this yet. I don't believe so. Richard was in Dubai when it was structured. He signed the documents without reading them. Gerald Foster retired. Nobody flagged it. Then we need to move before they find it and find a way to argue around it. She leaned back. I'm going to refer you to Marcus Webb in Scottsdale. He handles complex asset divorces. He's excellent, and he is going to want to file a formal inventory motion immediately. Get everything documented and in front of the court before Hale's team can restructure anything. The next morning, I called Marcus Webb's office. I had an appointment by Friday afternoon, but something else happened that Friday that I had not anticipated. Richard called me. Not his attorney, Richard himself. He used the tone he deployed in difficult conversations, the one that was warm at the surface but had a current running underneath it. I've been thinking, he said. I want this to be civil. I think we should have a conversation before the lawyers make it ugly. Of course, I said. Can we meet at Zinc on Saturday morning? Just coffee. I agreed. What I did not tell him was that I had an appointment with Marcus Webb 2 hours before our coffee meeting, or that on Thursday morning I had quietly logged into the company's banking portal using my still active COO credentials and begun the process of formally requesting a certified account history for all Mitchell Enterprises accounts going back 5 years, a request I was fully authorized to make, a request that would surface every Meridian Pacific Holdings transfer, every anomalous outflow, a request that, once submitted, would be very difficult to explain away. The certified account history arrived in my email on Friday evening. I sat in my home office with a glass of water. I had stopped drinking wine the week Richard announced the divorce, wanting my mind unimpaired, and opened the report. It took me 90 minutes to find it. Not just the transfers to the shell entities, something worse. Buried in the transaction history from 2021 was a series of internal reclassifications. Assets that had originally been capitalized under Mitchell Enterprises had been quietly reclassified as personal loans to the company from Richard Mitchell individually, creating, on paper, a debt that the company owed him. If accepted at face value, this debt would dramatically reduce the company's net value for divorce purposes, while simultaneously creating a claim Richard could use to extract cash from the company post-divorce. The reclassifications had been authorized by the company's CFO, a man named Brian Kessler, who had been hired by Richard personally in 2020, the same year, I now recalled, that Richard had asked me to step back a little from the day-to-day because he wanted to streamline the executive structure. I had agreed. I had been managing biscuit surgery recovery and had been grateful for the reduced load. Now I understood what I had actually been managed away from. I photographed every page of the report with my phone. I emailed it to Diana. I created a backup on a second encrypted drive and stored it in my car. Then I sat for a long time in the quiet of that office, in the house that was still technically ours, and felt something I can only describe as the sensation of a ground shifting underfoot. But shifting toward me, not away. I was past the point where any of this could be undone, not by Richard, not by Jonathan Hale, not by anyone. Does a man who underestimates his wife ever truly know her at all? I didn't sleep much that night, but I didn't need to. Marcus Webb was not what I had expected. He was a compact, unhurried man in his mid-50s, with an office that smelled of old paper and good leather, and a habit of pausing for several seconds before responding to anything, as if he ran every statement through a legal filter before allowing it to exit his mouth. He went through my documentation for 45 minutes without speaking. When he finally looked up, he said, "Mrs. Mitchell, I want to be certain I understand the scope of what you've brought me. You have documentation of approximately $1.255 million in potentially fraudulent transfers to shell entities. You have evidence of internal financial reclassifications that appear designed to artificially reduce the company's marital value. And you hold a 50% membership interest in Arcadia Asset Partners, LLC, a holding entity containing approximately $18 to $21 million in commercial real estate." "Yes," I said. "And your husband's attorney is Jonathan Hale?" "Yes." He paused, his characteristic 4 seconds. "Then we're going to need a forensic accountant." He slid a business card across the desk. "Tom Becker. He works with my office frequently. He's already certified in Arizona courts. I'll want him to review everything before we file." I had my meeting with Tom Becker that same afternoon in a glass-walled conference room in his downtown Phoenix office. He was younger than I expected, with the slightly distracted look of someone whose mind is always running calculations. He asked excellent questions. By the end of the meeting, he had a copy of every document I had assembled. The coffee meeting with Richard at Zinc that Saturday was the performance I had been preparing for since Sedona. He was already seated when I arrived, wearing the blue blazer he knew I liked. The gesture was not lost on me, an appeal to nostalgia disguised as casual dressing. He smiled when he saw me, the warm, effortful smile of a man managing a situation. We talked for 40 minutes. He spoke about fairness, about not wanting things to become adversarial, about the house and the dogs. He suggested a settlement figure, a number that, framed against what I now knew Arcadia Asset Partners LLC was worth, was almost insultingly modest. I listened. I nodded. I said I appreciated his transparency. I gave him nothing. 3 days later, Jonathan Hale's office filed a formal motion asserting that Mitchell Enterprises was Richard Mitchell's separate property, predating the marriage. It was precisely what Diana had predicted. The day after that, Marcus Webb filed our response. He attached the Arcadia Asset Partners, LLC operating agreement, the certified property records, and Tom Becker's preliminary report as exhibits. He filed a motion for full financial disclosure, citing the anomalous transfers and the internal reclassifications as evidence of potential asset concealment. I learned later, from Diana, who had a contact at a firm that occasionally worked with Hale, that when Jonathan Hale read our filing, he went very quiet for a long time. Then Richard called me. He did not use the warm tone this time. "What the hell are you doing?" His voice was controlled, but barely. "You are trying to destroy something I built, my company, my life's work." "I'm participating in legally mandated financial disclosure," I said, "as I'm required to." "Sarah." The way he said my name had shifted entirely. The warmth was gone. What remained was a version of Richard I had seen deployed against contractors, against vendors who underperformed, against people he considered obstacles. "You need to understand something. If you keep pushing this, I will make this the ugliest, most expensive divorce in the state. You will spend every dollar you think you're going to get on legal fees. I will drag this out for 3 years." "That's your right," I said, "and I'll start talking about you, about the things you've done, the decisions you made. He let that sit. The implication of something unspecified, the threat of narrative. My attorneys can paint you any way they want to. That's what they do. It was the moment I had anticipated, the moment when a man who has relied on intimidation his entire professional life reaches for it instinctively, like a hammer, because he knows no other tool. "Richard," I said quietly, "I've been managing your contracts for 8 years. Do you think I don't know what a threat sounds like?" He hung up. Jonathan Hale called Marcus Webb the next afternoon and requested a pause in proceedings to revisit certain preliminary filings, a tactical retreat dressed in procedural language. I drove home, let the dogs out into the backyard, and sat on the patio in the late afternoon heat. The jacaranda trees along the wall were in bloom, purple and excessive, the way Phoenix springs always are before the summer burns everything back. I had not taken a day for myself since March. I booked a room at a small spa resort outside Tucson for 4 days. I told Marcus Webb and Diana where I'd be. I told no one else. I swam in the mornings. I ate slowly. I read a novel I had been meaning to read for 2 years. I let myself sleep 8 hours. On the 3rd evening, sitting by the resort pool while the desert mountains turned pink and then purple in the failing light, I felt something unfamiliar settle into my chest. It took me a moment to name it. Calm. Not resignation. Not numbness. The specific earned calm of someone who has done the necessary work and now simply has to wait. I drove back to Phoenix on a Sunday morning with the windows down. The offer arrived on a Tuesday 10 days after I returned from Tucson. It came not through Jonathan Hale's office, but through an intermediary, a mutual acquaintance named Peter Daly, whom Richard and I had known for years through the Phoenix business community. Peter called me and asked if we could have lunch. His voice had the careful quality of a man who had been briefed on what to say and was uncomfortable saying it. We met at a terrace restaurant in Old Town Scottsdale. Peter ordered iced tea and looked like he would rather be somewhere else. "Richard asked me to reach out informally," he began. "I know," I said. He looked mildly startled. "He wants to make a new offer, not through the attorneys. He thinks the attorneys are making things worse. He's proposing—" Peter unfolded a note he had clearly written in advance, which struck me as both professional and deeply sad. "A clean separation. The house goes to you, valued at approximately $2.1 million. A cash settlement of $800,000 paid over 18 months. The company and all company assets remain with him, and the Arcadia entity is dissolved, with proceeds split 60-40 in his favor." I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. Did he really think a lunch table and a friendly face would accomplish what a phone threat had not? "Peter," I said, "what did he tell you about Arcadia Asset Partners?" Peter shifted in his chair. He said it was a technical accounting structure, a formality. A 50% membership interest in $18 million of commercial real estate is not a formality, I said. "Tell Richard I appreciate the gesture, but the proceedings will continue." Peter nodded with the defeated look of a man who had expected this answer and had agreed to deliver the message anyway out of loyalty to someone who probably didn't deserve it. We finished our drinks politely. He paid the bill. We parted in the parking lot with the brittle courtesy of people who understand they will not be having lunch again anytime soon. I drove home along Camelback Road, watching the luxury hotels and the palm trees slide past, and felt absolutely nothing about the offer. Not temptation, not regret, not even satisfaction at declining it. It was simply an event that had occurred and been processed. What I did feel, increasingly as the weeks accumulated, was isolation. Not from the case, from ordinary life, from the texture of daily human contact that isn't filtered through legal strategy. I had stopped attending the neighborhood book club because 2 of the women there were close to Richard's social circle. I had pulled back from the charity board I'd served on for 3 years, not wanting to navigate the politics of public sympathy during a high-profile divorce. My world had contracted to the house, the dogs, the gym I attended early in the morning before it filled up, and my attorney's offices. That was not sustainable. Diana saw it before I said it. She came back to Phoenix for a long weekend in late June, ostensibly to review documents with Marcus, but really, I think, to check on me. On Saturday evening, we drove out to the Desert Botanical Garden, which closes to regular visitors at 8, but holds member events through the summer evenings. We walked among the saguaros in the cooling air, and she didn't talk about the case at all. She talked about her own life in San Francisco, about a hiking trip she'd taken to Patagonia, about a man she was cautiously seeing who liked to cook elaborate dinners on weekends. It was the first evening in months where I existed as something other than a legal strategy. "You need people," Diana said as we stopped near the agave garden. The last light was behind the mountains. Not lawyers, people. I know. Who's left? Who was yours before Richard? I thought about it honestly. When you are married for 17 years to a man who is socially dominant, who fills every room, who selects the friends and the dinner parties and the charitable associations, you lose track of which relationships were yours and which were his adjuncts. But there were some. Kira Oduya, who had been my neighbor on the east side of Arcadia before we moved to the larger house. We had drifted, the way neighbors do when one of them moves, but we'd always liked each other genuinely. My cousin Marlene in Tempe, who had expressed skepticism about Richard at my bridal shower and never quite rescinded it. An old colleague from my law firm years, David Cheng, now practicing in California. That Sunday, I called all 3 of them. The conversations were awkward at the beginning, the particular awkwardness of dormant relationships being reactivated, and then they weren't. Kira came over the following weekend and we sat in the backyard with the dogs and didn't talk about the divorce for 2 hours. My cousin Marlene, who was brisk and practical and magnificently unsentimental, helped me reorganize the guest house into a proper home office. David Cheng emailed me a case from his research that had bearing on a question Marcus had raised about commingled assets. These were small things, but they reconstructed, incrementally, the sense that I was a person with a life, not a plaintiff in a proceeding. Richard, I heard through the social circuit that still connected us at the edges, had begun telling people that I had become someone he didn't recognize, that I was being advised by very aggressive attorneys. The narrative he was constructing, for mutual friends, for the business community, perhaps for himself, was of a wife who had been radicalized by her lawyers into weaponizing their divorce. It's remarkable, isn't it? How a man who initiates a proceeding to strip his wife of everything she helped build will describe her response to it as aggression. I heard this and felt for the first time a clean and uncomplicated anger. Not the hot, disorganizing kind, the focused kind, the kind that doesn't make you shake. It makes you steady. I went back to Marcus Webb's office that Thursday and told him I was ready for the next phase. She came on a Wednesday evening in early July. I didn't know she would be coming. I opened my front door expecting the package delivery I'd been tracking on my phone, and instead found Vanessa Cole standing on my porch in the early summer dusk, holding a bottle of Sancerre. I knew who she was. I had known for 4 months who she was, because Tom Becker had found her name during his forensic review. She appeared in the organizational structure of two of the shell entities, listed as a signatory. I had not yet raised this formally, saving it for the appropriate moment in the proceedings. Looking at her now, I understood that she didn't know I knew. She was younger than I expected. More nervous, too, beneath the polished surface. The wine was an attempt at disarming friendliness that the situation could not support. "Sarah," she said, "I know this is unexpected. I really wanted to talk to you, woman to woman." Woman to woman. The phrase people use when they want to appeal to solidarity while doing the opposite. I let her in because I wanted to hear what she had been sent to say. I did not take the wine. I led her to the living room and sat across from her and waited. She was good. I'll give her that. She spent the first 10 minutes expressing what sounded like genuine remorse for the circumstances. Careful not to admit to anything specifically, but performing contrition effectively. She talked about how she had developed feelings without intending to, how she understood I must be hurting, how she respected what I had built. Then she pivoted. "I'm actually here because I'm worried about you," she said. "I've seen how this plays out, Sarah. Jonathan Hale. I know you think your attorneys are well positioned, but his firm has resources that most people underestimate. The discovery process alone can go on for years. The legal fees will consume everything you might hope to recover." She paused. An actress's pause. "Richard is willing to improve the offer. Significantly. The cash settlement doubles. The house is yours outright. No equity split. There's a consulting arrangement with the company that would give you income for 3 years. She leaned forward slightly. "But this has to resolve now, Sarah, before the next court date, before things get—" Another calibrated pause. "Before certain things come out publicly that would be difficult for everyone." There it was, the threat inside the kindness. The certain things, vague enough to imply anything, specific enough to frighten. I looked at her for a moment. "Vanessa," I said, "what exactly are the things you believe would be difficult for me if they became public?" She was not prepared for a direct question. "I just mean, divorce proceedings can get very personal. Reputations." "My reputation," I said, "is that of a woman who managed a $47 million company for 8 years without a single regulatory violation, financial audit failure, or legal judgment against her. What would yours be once Tom Becker's report on Meridian Pacific Holdings, LLC, reaches the court?" The color shifted in her face. A subtle thing, but I was watching for it. "I don't know what you're referring to," she said. "Meridian Pacific Holdings," I repeated, "and Coastal Development Trust, and Blue River Partners, LLC. All 3 formed within the past 4 years. All 3 recipients of transfers from Mitchell Enterprises operating accounts. Your name appears as a signatory on 2 of the formation documents." I kept my voice entirely level. "I'm sure Jonathan Hale is aware of this, but I wonder if he's explained to Richard exactly what a forensic accountant's report on these entities looks like in a family court disclosure proceeding." Vanessa stood up. She was no longer performing warmth. The mask, and it had been a mask, well made but unmistakably a mask, was gone. What remained was something colder and less polished. "You're making a mistake," she said. "You're welcome to let yourself out," I said. She left the Sancerre on my coffee table. I watched her car pull out of the driveway from the living room window. Then I sat back down and let myself feel what was actually present. Not triumph. Something quieter. Something that lived adjacent to fear. Because she had said, "You're making a mistake," with a specificity that didn't feel like bluster. She had said it the way people say things they believe. And Vanessa Cole Whatever else she was not stupid. She had been embedded in the company's financial structure for years. She knew things I might not have found yet. I sat with that fear for about 20 minutes. I let it exist without running from it or suppressing it. And then I noticed something interesting. It didn't weaken me. It sharpened me. Like a blade drawn across a stone, the resistance was the mechanism. Every threat they made was, in its own way, a confirmation that I was positioned exactly where I needed to be. Frightened people don't threaten people who aren't dangerous to them. I picked up my phone and texted Marcus Webb. Vanessa Cole came to my house this evening. She referenced Meridian, Coastal Development, and Blue River by implication. I think we're close to something. Call me tomorrow. Then I fed the dogs, locked the doors, and went to bed. I slept better than I had in weeks. The deposition was scheduled for a Thursday in August in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Phoenix. Glass walls on two sides, the city spread out below in the white summer heat, the kind of room designed to make everyone feel exposed. Richard arrived with Jonathan Hale and 2 associates. Hale was exactly as I had imagined him, a tall man in his early 60s, silver-haired, with the measured movements of someone who had spent decades controlling rooms. He shook Marcus Webb's hand with the courtesy of 2 generals meeting before a battle neither intends to lose. Richard didn't look at me when he sat down. I had been in this building before, years ago, for a commercial lease negotiation on behalf of Mitchell Enterprises. I remembered the elevator, the way the city spread out on approach. Back then, I had walked in as Richard's representative, carrying his documents, speaking with his authority. Now I sat across from him as his legal adversary, carrying my own. Tom Becker had delivered his completed forensic report to Marcus 3 weeks earlier. It was 68 pages. The executive summary alone was 11. What it documented in the methodical language of forensic accounting was the following: $2.1 million in total transfers from Mitchell Enterprises to entities controlled, directly or indirectly, by Richard Mitchell, beginning in 2020. The internal reclassifications that had created a fictitious debt of $3.4 million owed by the company to Richard personally, and the finding Tom had called me about at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, his voice carrying the restrained excitement of someone who has found what they were looking for. Evidence that Vanessa Cole had received compensation from 2 of the shell entities, totaling $340,000 over 3 years, during which time she was simultaneously drawing a full salary as VP of Mitchell Enterprises, self-dealing, breach of fiduciary duty, and depending on how the transfers were ultimately characterized, potentially much more. I had known all of this for weeks. I had prepared for this room for months, and yet sitting across from Richard Mitchell in that glass-walled conference space 14 floors above Phoenix, something clarified that I had not expected. I felt nothing about him, not anger, not grief, not the complicated residue of 17 years. He was simply a man at a table, and I was simply the person who knew more than he did. Marcus began. He walked Richard through the Arcadia Asset Partners, LLC documents first, methodically, without drama. Richard confirmed his signature. He confirmed the formation date. He confirmed the transfer of properties into the entity. Hale interjected twice with objections that were noted and overruled by the agreed-upon process, and each time Richard had to reconfirm the facts. Hale had known about Arcadia, had known for weeks since our initial filing. He had attempted to argue that the entity was a business asset, not a marital asset. Marcus had the operating agreement, the dates, the property histories. The argument had already substantially failed in the preliminary motions. What Hale did not know, what no one on their side knew, was what was coming next. Marcus pivoted to the transfers. Richard's first answer about Meridian Pacific Holdings, LLC, was confident. A vendor relationship, prepayment for construction services. He had rehearsed this answer, I could tell. The cadence was slightly too smooth, the language slightly too settled. It was the answer of a man who had practiced it in a mirror. Marcus placed Tom Becker's report on the table. He asked Richard to turn to page 22. Page 22 contained a table showing that Meridian Pacific Holdings, LLC, had no registered contractors, no active construction licenses, no completed projects, and no employees in Arizona. It had one function that the forensic analysis could identify: receiving money from Mitchell Enterprises and dispersing it. Richard looked at the page for a long time. "I'd need to review this with my team," he said. "Of course," Marcus said pleasantly. "Let's move to Coastal Development Trust." Hale leaned over and said something quietly to Richard. Richard's jaw tightened. The next 40 minutes were the most carefully uncomfortable thing I have ever witnessed. Richard's answers, which had been smooth and pre-prepared, became slower, more qualified, increasingly dependent on phrases like, "to the best of my recollection," and "I would need to review the specific documents." He contradicted himself twice. Once on the date he claimed to have first engaged Meridian, and once on who he said had recommended the entity, first naming his CFO, and then, when Marcus produced an email showing the CFO had no prior knowledge of Meridian, attributing the referral to a real estate broker he couldn't name precisely. I watched Hale during those 40 minutes as much as I watched Richard. The attorney's face remained professionally neutral, but there were small signs, a slight stillness in his posture, a fractional delay before his interjections, that told me he was recalibrating. A lawyer of Hale's caliber does not panic, but he reads rooms, and this room was telling him something he did not want to hear, that his client had not told him everything. Hale called a recess. In the hallway outside the conference room, I stood by the window with Marcus and Diana, who had come down from San Francisco for this. Below us, Phoenix shimmered in the August heat, the grid of streets stretching to the mountains. "He's unraveling," Diana said quietly, not with satisfaction, as a clinical observation. "Hale will try to reassemble him," Marcus said. "It won't be enough. The internal contradictions are on the record now." When we returned to the room, something had changed in the arrangement. Hale sat closer to Richard, a subtle repositioning, the attorney moving to physically anchor his client. Richard himself had shed the controlled affect of the morning. He looked, for the first time in my memory of him, genuinely uncertain, not angry, not strategic, uncertain, the way a man looks when the architecture he has been standing on begins to shift. Marcus placed one more document on the table. It was Vanessa Cole's compensation records from the two shell entities, cross-referenced against her Mitchell Enterprises salary history. "Mr. Mitchell," Marcus said, "can you explain the relationship between Vanessa Cole and Coastal Development Trust?" Richard looked at the document. Then he looked at Jonathan Hale. Then he looked, for the first time all morning, directly at me. I looked back. I did not look away. I did not look triumphant. I simply looked at him with the same steady attention I would give to any document I was reviewing. I thought of the kitchen on that Tuesday morning in May, the blue sky through the window, his press suit, the word "okay" that had thrown him off balance because it contained none of the responses he had rehearsed against. He had spent 17 years believing he understood me. In this room, with this document between us, he was beginning to understand the actual cost of that assumption. What does a man see in that moment when he finally understands the full dimension of what he underestimated? Richard Mitchell said nothing for 14 seconds. I counted. Then he said, "I think we need to take a break." The settlement negotiations lasted 11 days. 11 days during which Jonathan Hale's office, for all its reputation and resources, had the unenviable task of working with a client whose deposition transcript contained 17 instances of material inconsistency, a forensic accounting report documenting $2.1 million in questionable transfers, and an impending disclosure to the Arizona Corporation Commission that Marcus Webb had quietly informed them was forthcoming regardless of how the civil matter resolved. Richard Mitchell had spent 20 years building a reputation in the Phoenix business community as a decisive, visionary executive. The deposition transcript, if it became part of any public proceeding, would reconstruct that reputation entirely. That was his actual exposure, not just the financial liability, the narrative liability, the story that would replace the one he had been telling. Hale did not panic. He maneuvered. Over 11 days, he made 3 successive offers, each one better than the last, each one feeling like a man calibrating exactly how much he had to give to make the larger problem stop. The first offer, the house, a cash settlement of $1.2 million, and a 50-50 split of the Arcadia Asset Partners, LLC portfolio. Marcus rejected it without calling me. We had discussed the parameters in advance, and I had been very clear. The second offer, the house, $1.8 million cash, and a 60% share of the Arcadia portfolio, with a structured buyout of Richard's 40% interest over 5 years. We countered. The third offer, arriving on a Friday evening in an email Hale sent to Marcus at 6:47 p.m., was the one that ended it. The house, in my name, unencumbered, $2.3 million in cash within 60 days. 70% of the Arcadia portfolio transferred to a new entity in my name, with the remaining 30% purchasable at a fixed price over 3 years, 8 years of spousal support, and, the piece I considered non-negotiable, a full release of any claims against me personally, professionally, or reputationally, executed and notarized. The release mattered because it foreclosed the vague threats. Whatever Richard and Vanessa had believed they could deploy against my reputation, he signed away the right to deploy it, in exchange for avoiding a public proceeding that would have been far more damaging to his own. I reviewed the document for 3 hours in Marcus's conference room, with Diana on the phone from San Francisco. 52 pages. On page 47, a clause confirmed that Mitchell Enterprises' valuation was locked at the time of filing. Richard could not retroactively restructure anything. On page 51, a clause I had asked Marcus to include, Richard acknowledged that the $3.4 million in internal reclassifications were rescinded. He would not be able to use them going forward. I signed on a Monday morning. Marcus shook my hand. "In 30 years of practice," he said, "I've rarely seen a client arrive with a case as thoroughly prepared as yours." "I was an attorney," I said. "I know, but most people, even attorneys, fall apart when it's personal. You didn't." What I didn't tell him was that I had come very close, more than once. The nights in Sedona, the Friday with the certified account history and the glass of water, the evening Vanessa stood in my living room with her bottle of Sancerre and her calibrated threat. I had not been steady because I was unaffected. I had been steady because I had done the work while the fear was present, not instead of it, but alongside it. I drove home through Phoenix, stopped at a bakery I used to like before Richard decided it was too casual for our social image, and sat at a window table with a coffee and a pastry, watching the street. At some point, I realized I was smiling, not because I had won exactly. It's too simple to call it winning when what you've actually done is recover something that was always yours. It was more like the restoration of a balance that should never have been disturbed. Richard Mitchell had walked into our kitchen on a Tuesday morning in May, confident that 17 years of marriage had left me with nothing that mattered. He'd been wrong about almost everything, but most fundamentally, he had been wrong about that. 14 months after I signed those 52 pages, I was sitting on the terrace of a small apartment in Santa Fe, New Mexico, drinking my morning coffee and watching the desert light turn the adobe walls golden. I had sold the Scottsdale house 6 weeks after the settlement. I didn't need to sell. The settlement had made me financially independent, but I wanted to. Every room had a version of Richard in it. I wanted walls that were simply walls. I chose Santa Fe partly for practicality. New Mexico had a streamlined attorney reinstatement process, and partly because it was completely mine. No shared history, no memory attached to any street or table. I reinstated my bar license in November and joined a small firm specializing in business and family law. The work came back immediately, entirely intact, as if it had simply been waiting. Biscuit and Duke adjusted within a week. Morning trail walks became the rhythm that organized my days. Diana visited in October. We hiked through aspen groves just turning gold. "You look different," she said, occupied quiet, like you finally have enough to think about that matches who you actually are. She was right. Richard kept Mitchell Enterprises, what he had most wanted, but 2 major partners had quietly reduced their exposure after the forensic review. The Tempe development fell through. Kessler resigned. His replacement ordered a full audit immediately. The world doing its arithmetic without any help from me. Vanessa left the company in August and Phoenix shortly after. The Corporation Commission inquiry proceeded at its own pace. I felt nothing particular about any of it. She had made choices and was living with them. The most honest summary of most human situations. What I felt instead was quieter than I had expected. The daily, incremental discovery of who I was when nobody else was defining the terms. The hiking I had abandoned, the law I had set down, all of it simply there, waiting. I had built something for 17 years that a man decided to take. When he tried, I turned out to be the kind of person who had been quietly making it impossible the entire time. Not through cunning or revenge, but through the simple habit of doing the work thoroughly and keeping records. What happens when a man mistakes your silence for weakness? He finds out, eventually, what it actually was.